Good evening. Welcome to a presentation on preservation, part of the housing solution. I'm Peg Breen, president of the New York Landmarks Conservancy. Housing supply and housing affordability have always been issues in New York City. They are front and center now. Unfortunately, some officials have the belief that preservation and historic districts are an impediment to new housing. There's also a widespread assumption that if you just keep building more and more housing of any type, prices will come down. Economist Donovan Rypkema is with us tonight to present some facts about historic districts and about the more is more housing theory. Donovan founded PlaceEconomics in Washington, D.C. He's done studies on the economic benefits of preservation here in New York City and in cities across the country and around the world. Please put any questions you have for Donovan into the chat, and we'll get to as many of them as possible when he finishes. And if you would like AIA credit for this evening, there's information in the chat on that as well. Now, I am pleased to present Donovan Rypkema.
Thanks, Peg. And I'm going to figure out how to share my screen. Hopefully that does it. Well, thanks very much. I mean, the Landmarks Conservancy is a favorite client of ours, so I always appreciate being invited to do something else. And I'm going to really talk about some facts about density, because this issue of density is very important, and of course is a critique of historic districts. And I also want to talk about this concept of filtering that says we just build enough gazillion-dollar apartments, everything else will be taken care of. But at first, I want to be kind of geeky and give some methodological notes. So I'm being the academic kind here, but I think it's important to understand. We did a study for PEG and for the Conservancy about a decade ago, and we looked at things like density, and we made some measurements, but at the time, just about when we were starting the study, the Furman Institute at NYU had done just a superb job of looking at historic districts, what's covered by under the purview of the Landmarks Commission in the city. And so although I think it was Rebney that paid for their work, they did a great job, very high level of integrity, of academic integrity. So they did a great job. So we just used their density numbers. And no apologies for that, but we've changed that for this look this time. When I was with Peg 6 weeks ago, where she had a symposium about housing in New York, and subsequent to that, she said, "Would you be interested in doing a webinar about this issue?" And I said, "Sure, but I think that we need to take a new look at the question. I think we need to do the new numbers. We can't use 10-year-old numbers." There's been development, there's been population growth, been new historic districts, so we need to look a little differently. And so we have. And what the Furman Institute did was look at everything, both historic districts and landmarks. We're only looking at historic districts, and for a number of reasons. First, under the New York law, well, Central Park is a landmark, but Central Park doesn't have much to do with density unless you decide building housing on it. And then other individual landmarks, City Hall or St. Patrick's, they also, I mean, most of the individual landmarks are not residential properties. They don't have much to do with this density issue. And then many of the great landmark residential properties, like the Dakota, for example, well, they're also in historic districts, so we're going to capture those populations. So that's one reason for the change. The second reason is we've kind of improved methodologies. We've gotten tighter on looking at things. And then we kind of have defaulted to the way that density is measured that the Census Bureau uses. So the numbers are a bit different. The patterns are going to be the same, but I just wanted you to know we're looking at historic districts, and that makes a difference. So here's what we start out with. And again, you'll see this map again in a minute, but here is the density map in New York City. And the darkest area is what's called the very high density areas, and that's over 120,000 people square mile, and then the brown, dark brown, is a high density, and then modest, medium density, and then a low density. So we start out with, so what are we talking about? So we looked at each of the 5 boroughs and the city as a whole. How many people live there? What's the square mile? What density that means? So that's kind of the base upon which we built the other things. So we looked at each of the 5 boroughs. So alphabetical order. So the Bronx, 43 square miles, 1.4 million in population. 1% of the Bronx is in historic districts, but about 1.2% of this Bronx population lives there. And so the density in the Bronx, 43,000 people per square mile in the historic districts, about 11,000 more, 10,000 more than in the rest of the Bronx. Here's Brooklyn, 69 square miles, 2.6 million people. Larger share, about a little over 3% of the land area in Brooklyn is in historic districts, but that accommodates 5% of the population there. And here's where the biggest spread in density is, where the density in the rest of the Bronx, 37,000 people per square mile, in historic districts, 60,000 per square mile. Yeah, so historic districts are really preventing density, right? Then Manhattan, of course, the one that has much of the focus, 22 square miles, 1.6 million in population. And then here's this number's been floating around. It's really been floating around since the Furman study. Well, that 20% of Manhattan is in historic, landmark. Well, yeah, Central Park is a landmark, and that takes up a bunch of land area. But in terms of the residential area, and that's the area where this density becomes an issue in historic districts. And of course, not all historic districts are residential, but the bulk of them are. It's only 12% of Manhattan, not 20%. In fact, it's covered by historic districts. I should have mentioned there's one other reason that we decided to just look at districts and not landmarks, is that the YIMBY people and their kind of intellectual godfather Ed Glazer, they're not so concerned about landmarks. Their big critique focuses on districts, and so it's districts we want to talk about. So the population, 214,000 people live in historic districts. Density in historic districts in Manhattan, 76,000 people a square mile, 6,000 more than in the rest of Manhattan. Then in Queens, again, small share, 1% of the area in historic districts, a little 1.2% of the population. But again, density in historic districts, 43,000. In the rest of the borough, 33,000. And the only place where, in fact, there is low density historic districts is in Staten Island, a low density borough, by far the lowest density. And so that's the one place where, in fact, the density in the historic districts is a bit lower than in the rest of the borough. So we're not hiding any facts, but that's what they are. So when you look at then as in the composite in New York as a whole, 302 square miles, 8.5 million people, density area about 7 square miles, or 2.3% of the city of New York in historic districts, accommodating almost 5% of the population. Citywide, density in historic districts, 57,000. Density in the rest of the city, 27,000. So this idea that somehow historic districts are the enemy of density is sheer, absolute, unequivocal nonsense. Just ain't so. So I'm going to put that stuff aside and then just talk about this map one more time. So we mapped out these, where the high density, the low density, the medium density areas in Manhattan at the census block level. The census block is 5 or 6 city blocks. 1.3% of the low density areas are in historic districts. Again, in the share of the land area in the city of New York, 2.3% of it is in historic districts. 1.3% of the low density are historic districts. 1.9 of the medium density are in historic districts. 2.3 of the whole city in historic districts, 6.4 of the high density, 7.5% of the very high density areas are in fact historic districts. Where the density is coming from in the city of New York is from historic districts, not historic districts preventing density from happening. If historic districts had the same density as the rest of the city of New York, there'd be 214,000 people who couldn't find a home here. If the density, it's that extra density, in fact, provides home for 214,000 people. Now, there's this theory of filtering that if you build enough, everything is going to take care of itself. And it doesn't work. At least it doesn't work in New York City. It's this idea that we'll add density to areas that are already dense. We're going to build it with luxury housing, and the kind of trickle down is going to make housing affordable at the bottom end. Well, in fact, there's a net loss of baseline affordability. But I want to be kind of geeky here and just step back about what the theory of filtering is. It's based on the law of supply and demand. I'm a good market economy guy. But if the supply increases, the demand remains constant, then the prices are going to fall. That's the theory of market economics. And so filtering says that if you build a new unit at the market, even if it's at the top of the market, that's going to open up units filtering down, trickling down to the bottom, and then it's going to open up a unit at the bottom of the market. And if enough of those things are built, that unit at the bottom of the market is going to get cheaper. And since the supply has increased, the unit at the bottom will be less expensive. That's the theory. Works in theory, doesn't work in practice. What this idea that top end units create affordable housing in the bottom, it just doesn't work. And here's the reasons. The theory assumes that an increased demand is a rate no greater than the number of new units created. Well, that doesn't work. If there's more increased demand than units created, doesn't work. Second, it assumes that their upward movement is within the city, that I get a raise, I can get a little more expensive housing unit, and I move up, and the unit I vacated is available for somebody to move up before me. And so that is supposed to work all the way down the line. So somebody that doesn't have a house gets to move into the one that the lowest level was able to move out of to move up. Great theory, but it assumes that movement is within the city. If the wealthy buyer of that top end unit comes from someplace else, don't come from the city, there's no unit being opened up. So the trickle down theory doesn't make sense. It also assumes that when I move up, I'm exchanging my new, nicer, more expensive resident for one behind. But that doesn't work when the residence I'm buying is the second or third or the fourth one that I own. There aren't those units being created, and I'm saturating with my demand for 3 or 4 or 5 households worth of housing. And then when the additions to the housing stock are at the top of the market, the theory only works if all the in-migration is at the bottom of the market, and that doesn't work. And finally, the whole trickle-down filtering system only works if when that filtering takes place, the units at the bottom of the market are kept in place. Well, it doesn't work if bottom of the unit markets are raised or demolished, like lots are. So that's why it doesn't work. What is true, absolutely unequivocally true, is that any affordable housing has to start with NOAH, with the naturally occurring affordable housing. But the reality is there's no such thing as new NOAH. You can't build new and rent and sell cheap, or without at least hugely deep subsidies. So that's the story about density, and that's about the filtering theory. But we're a firm, I think a reputable research firm, but we're often accused saying, well, yeah, but we knew that those would be the conclusions that they'd reach. They're a big preservation firm, and we are, no denying that. So here's what I decided to do as an experiment. I took nothing but the Excel sheets that had all of the numbers, population area numbers. It's the only thing put in, and I fed it into an AI thing and said, okay, just look at this data and tells me what it says. No bias, no saying, make it look for, I said, here's the numbers, look at them, summarize what it says. And I asked them to do a slide deck with it. I did it twice. So this isn't even me talking. This is the stupid artificial intelligence. So here is the first slide deck that created. Spatial reality check on New York's historic districts. The ongoing debate around housing often positions historic districts as static neighborhoods, frozen in time, insulated from the density. By isolating the footprint of historic districts, a paradox of spatial efficiency, landmark areas disproportionately carry a share of the city's population. And then again, talks about our methodology. We just took out what are historic districts and say what's true there, what's the rest of the borough. And then they talk about the density, the land area density, the population that's in historic districts compared to the area in historic districts. Talk about the density per square mile. So they just took the numbers. They just recapped again our kind of table of density. And then here's where you know it was AI that doesn't quite get it, and not us who made it. They say landmark. No, it's not landmark. It's historic district. So here's Manhattan with the density numbers for Manhattan. Here it is for two of the outer boroughs, and then the rest of the borough here, and then talk again. Admittedly on Staten Island where it's less. But so the blueprint of density, 2% of the land, 5% of the people, twice the spatial deficiency. So I did it once, and then their conclusion, preservation and profound density already coexist. And then I want to do it again. So it wasn't a mistake. Same basis, numbers only into the system. Perception, historic district perceived as low density. Analysis of 2024 borough demographics reveal a vastly different reality. Historic preservation in New York City maps directly onto spaces of intense utilization and disproportionately high density. Again, some maps about the area, the stuff, the share that's in historic districts, the density, the population in New York City, the difference between share of people and share of land area, how many people live in each of the boroughs, historic districts, the difference in density citywide, again, the kind of table, and an interesting kind of chart where they look at where the density is greater than the population share in the area. And then again, just kind of wrap up, accounting for just 3.3% of the physical land mass, 5% of the population. These designated zones are not static monuments. They are among the most intensely utilized, densely inhabited urban grids in the nation. So you didn't have some preservationist guy telling you that stupid AI stuff. Said, this is the conclusion. This is what the facts tell us about New York. So with that, I'll just shut up and happy to later take questions. And I know I'm going to quit sharing and give it back to Peg.
Yeah, there we go. Am I unmuted now or not?
Yep.
Okay, sorry. This is our first webinar, folks, and we're learning as we go along. We've been saying that no more than 5% of the land are historic districts. We can even revise that down now. That's fabulous. What I wanted to show just briefly before we get to questions, though, is that historic districts certainly contain affordable housing for a lot of the people who live there, currently affordable housing, and they've always contributed to new housing through transformation. So I just have a few examples of some of the buildings that have been turned into housing, just to show you how widespread it's been, and that's been going on for years. So this is a former police precinct, and it now has rooms and services for formerly homeless men. This is a beautiful school in Upper Manhattan, and it now has affordable units for local artists as well as community space. This was a former fire headquarters in Brooklyn. This is one of the older conversions, and it's residential, and it made space for some of the people who were displaced by a nearby economic development. Okay. Another beautiful school, this in Harlem, that is now moderate and affordable housing. Next. These are wonderful former hospital buildings in Upper Manhattan that are now market rate housing. This giant hospital in Queens is now all affordable housing. This building in near Gramercy Park was a residence and club for young women coming to New York, hoping for careers in the arts, and is now being turned into senior housing. And finally, this incredible Art Deco skyscraper is now market rate condos, luxury condos, and it was the largest residential conversion in the city when it was completed a couple of years ago. So throughout the city and with all kinds of buildings, landmark buildings have created new housing and will continue to do so. So let's see what questions have come in. My colleague Andrea Goldwyn has been checking on those. Andrea?
Sure, thank you, Peg and Donovan. So the first question we have is about the abundance theory, which has certainly gotten a lot of attention. And the question is, we hear that abundance is the way of the future. I think, Donovan, you've pushed back against that quite a lot for New York. Are there other places where it's working, and what would be the differences from New York?
You're muted, Donovan. There we go.
Now I don't want to share again, so I'm looking at my own PowerPoint, and I've seen it before, so I don't care to see it. Well, let me go back to I'd rather talk about the filtering thing, because I said it doesn't work in New York, and I'm skeptical. I'll give an exception to that and a why of that. And the only reason that was tipped off was because there was a Pew research study released, I don't know, a couple of weeks ago, saying here's an example of where filtering has worked. That in fact prices have come down, however nominally, in rental properties, and that is in Austin. So I thought, well, that's really interesting. I'd love to be proven wrong. So why is that true? Well, here's why. Number one, Austin over the last decade has annexed an amount of land about half the size of Manhattan, an option that New York City didn't have. Your borders are what there are. Second, they have put in hundreds of millions of dollars into affordable housing in Austin. That's helped the whole framework. And third, so a former colleague of mine is a preservation officer in Austin. So I said, has this filtering, this keep building more and it'll work, has it affected historic districts? She said, really not at all. That it just hasn't been imposed on the historic district. So I guess, given some constraints, you have enough land, you keep growing, you can work, I guess. But I'm very skeptical that it can work at all in New York City.
Great, thank you. So we have some questions about the NOAAs.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on the relationship of a NOAA to a typical residential historic district?
Well, a great question, and I wish I had a good answer, but so I can't give you a New York specific answer because we haven't done the research. But in a number of our recent studies, a recent one in Philadelphia just released like 2 months ago or 3 months ago, and another one we did earlier in Dallas. We simply looked at older housing stock, whether or not it was in historic districts or even whether it belonged in historic districts. We just said older stuff. What's the older stuff do in terms of its contribution to housing affordability? And I think because of the nature of the cities, in Philadelphia, we defined older housing stock as stuff that was built, I think before 1950. In Dallas, we said built before 1970. And disproportionately, that older housing stock is where housing affordability comes from. And it comes from the marketplace. Vast majority don't have any subsidies, don't have any rent control, don't have anything. It just to be affordable because it's still in place in the market. Now, it depends location to location. about how either the property value or the rent levels vary between older housing in general and older housing that's within historic districts. And in candor, in most cases, many of the historic districts, while they may in fact be more affordable than the whole, will be historic district housing less affordable than simply older housing, no housing. Not always true, and in nearly every place we've looked, there'll be some historic districts that have rent levels at the lower end of even just the whole older housing thing. So we just have kind of thought it's important that we all, as preservationists, we need to take a deep breath and say, we need to be talking about saving stuff, whether or not it's appropriate to designate it as a historic district. That it's all the fabric of our city, and it's a huge environmental waste to throw it away. And we need now to recognize that we kind of have a responsibility to say, we need to be taking care of the whole range of needs, even if it's not in historic districts. So more and more preservationists, I think, around the country have become big advocates of saving old stuff, whether or not it's fits somebody's definition of appropriate to historically designate.
Yeah, I think there's another question on the NOAAs that's similar, and just to see if there's anything more to add to what you were just talking about, can you discuss more about the inability to create and need to preserve the NOAAs, how most of it is old but not designated, and could designation be used as a tool to preserve them?
Yeah, that fabulous question, and maybe, and my concern with that is that it would just kind of increase the argument. Oh, geez, now you preservationists want to go from what we think is 20% to 90% and blah blah blah. But we do about 60% of our work is in the work like we've done for the New York Landmarks Conservancy, and that is evaluative impacts of preservation. Another third or so is on policy recommendations, mostly to encourage investment in historic resources and make recommendation for tools, incentive strategies for historic preservation. We have added in recent years a recommendation that when a new historic district is created, it simultaneously should be identified as an affordable housing district. And we don't even know what that means, except it's saying to the city, there's both fear, sometimes founded, some not, that if you designate a historic district, that might have an adverse pricing impact on some people. So we ought to be mitigating that from the beginning. And so whatever tools you have, city of X, you ought to, when you create a new historic district, then concentrate that tools there. Historic preservation, not just about the buildings, also about the people. And preservationists haven't always been significantly cognizant of that or sympathetic to that. And I think we need to do it. But I think also conservation districts are a way that are less robust. I used to be a big skeptic. I've kind of changed my mind about that. I think conservation districts have a place, and that kind of keeping housing affordable is important. But I think more than anything, that at every level of decision making, the number one, period, no exception priority in affordable housing strategies is we got to keep what we've got. Period. We got to keep what we got, or we're never going to. You cannot build out of it. I'll give you one more little factoid in the older housing stuff. We have a great program at the federal level, been around for around 25 years or so. Low-income housing tax credit. Great program. Over the course of its life, it's created about 3 million low-income housing units. That's wonderful. Over the same period, we have torn down 11.5 million housing units built before 1950. Well, no, you can't, it doesn't work. If you're tearing down 3 times or 4 times as many as you're building. And parallel to that is there was a great firm, I wish we could take credit for it, great firm here in Washington that looked at all of the low-income housing tax credit programs or projects around the country. And they calculated an average per unit cost. Now, that varies gargantuanly from from Sturgis, South Dakota, population 5,000, in New York City or Los Angeles or San Francisco. So forget the number doesn't fit for New York. Numbers change, but the average across the country per unit cost using the low-income housing tax credit, building a new structure, $213,000. Average cost, low-income housing tax credit program, reusing existing building, including acquisition, $159,000. So even if the only thing you care about is saving taxpayers' dollars or stretching programs, the priority for that program ought to be reusing existing buildings as the top priority. State housing authorities, who are the ones that assign the credit, the low-income housing tax credit, ought to say 90% of them are going to go to existing buildings, or so we can save money and build more affordable housing. Not that I feel strongly about that issue, but.
Following up on that, Donovan, can you talk a little bit more about conservation districts? We don't have any here in New York.
Sure. And for a long time, they were kind of dismissed by preservation, including me, frankly, about, well, it's just preservation light. It's kind of, well, you're not really doing anything. And if they really want to be in a historic district, be in a historic district. But they've kind of evolved, and I think successfully. At one time, among preservationists, the theory was, well, we'll make them a conservation district where there's a little less robust regulation, mostly regulate things like infill and setback requirements and massing, but kind of less robust than most the design guidelines in historic districts would be. With the theory, preservationists argued that we'll make it a conservation district. It can stay that for 3 or 4 years, and they'll see, well, this isn't that onerous. Let's become a real historic district. Well, Nashville was a place that thought that would be the idea, and they created, I think, 21 conservation districts. How many are still conservation districts? 21. But if you drive through these places, in fact, they're very credible. You wouldn't say that this is no kind of lesser quality. Sometimes they're appropriate. They're often driven from the bottom up. Conservation districts are most frequently created by the neighbors who are saying, we don't want our neighborhood screwed up by a bunch of out of scale, overbearing development. Sometimes that's driven by some character. Now, it might not be as character rich as these wonderful brownstones in Harlem that's in the picture behind me. But the character might be a kind of local character, but they're often a way to maintain a kind of connection of the neighbors to their neighborhood. And they will, and again, usually for conservation districts, the neighbors themselves have a large role into saying, here's what the standards or the guidelines or whatever are going to be. And yes, they're usually kind of less robust than historic districts, but they're often created in areas where there might be so much loss of historic fabric over the years that there's kind of not enough integrity to real, in good conscience, create a historic district. But it's a way to kind of keep what's there and to have at least some influence on what happens, how it evolves in the future. But I think there's some good examples, and many cities. San Antonio, that we do a lot of work for, is one. Phoenix is another, and again, Nashville have both, and I become a believer in them in certain circumstances.
Okay, another kind of question. Is there a way to limit luxury units in the new buildings that are replacing older buildings? A lot of the new buildings have fewer units. They're replacing buildings that have many more units.
Well, that's right. And that's one of these frauds about this whole idea that, well, we'll build these skyscrapers and, 50 stories, 80 stories high, whatever it is, and we're going to increase density. Well, no, you replaced a building that had, I don't know, 1,100 square foot or 900 square foot units, and you're replacing it with 3,000 or 4,000 square foot units. I don't care. And with somebody who lives there a third of the time. In fact, I'm not so sure that they don't have maybe they don't have a negative effect on density in wherever they're being built, but it's going to be nominal, frankly, because of who's living there, the size of the units, the scale of the development. So yeah, if that 80-story building were filled up with 900 square foot apartments, yeah, you'd have a lot of density. Good, I'd sign on to that, but that ain't what's happening.
Okay, this is an inside New York question, so throw it out to both of you, and it's a long question. The fair housing fast track formula is at cross purposes with preservation, affordability, and density. And this is a program where the city is determining which of the 12 community districts have produced the least new affordable housing. And in those areas, the regulations and the public review process will be limited. And the question goes on to say, the fast track only looks at new affordable housing, not existing. It incentivizes tearing down smaller, older buildings like tenements and putting up taller luxury buildings, which are usually less dense and only have a few affordable units, affordable for whom, and there are no provisions for historic districts. How do we raise a red flag about this incorrect way of achieving affordable units? In the questioner's experience, historic districts like the West Village often tend to be even more diverse.
Well, part of that is on us. Part of that is on the conservation groups. And part of that is taking the information that Donovan is giving us and using it and lobbying and getting this message out. And I know it's of concern to our colleague groups. So part of that is definitely up to us, but it's also definitely unfair to historic districts because we've just seen how dense they are. We've just seen that they contain currently affordable housing and a lot of affordable housing. And they get no credit for it because they're in buildings that have been there. So it is flawed, but it's going to take a lot of concerted effort to get the facts out. Donovan, anything to add?
Well, of course, I don't know the nuances of all the New York things, but I assume I will wager that on the city council, on the city of New York, there are council members who don't give a damn about historic preservation, but are big environmentalists. Oh, we got to save the planet. We got to blah, blah, blah. There is nothing you can do that is more environmentally destructive than tearing stuff away and throwing it out, period. You can't be telling me you're an environmentalist when you're throwing away buildings, period.
Okay, and a related question, independent of historic districts, there is some recognition in New York that there are perhaps 60 to 70,000 vacant units in New York's older buildings that landlords can't afford to renovate because of changes to the tax codes. Any suggestions for how to address this problem?
Well, I think it ought to be a top priority. And again, I come from the real estate business. I don't want people to have to go broke by owning real estate. So there needs to be you ought to step back and say, what do we want to do? We want to add to the housing supply, and we want to do it as both efficient and effective and sensitive and environmentally sensitive way as possible. That means figuring out a way how to get those 60 units back on the market. That'd make a huge dent, at least. And if it costs money to do that, there is a public benefit to having that housing available that does not accrue to the property owner. The fact that somebody has a place to live, that you can still be an actor or a bank teller or a waiter in New York City and live here, there's a public benefit to that. So I think we have to step back, particularly for kind of small scale landowners that lots of those buildings are in. I mean, they're giant guys, they can afford what they want. But on those small scales, saying, look, it's not that we're trying to make this guy richer. What we're trying to do is get the public benefit of having housing back in the marketplace. And so if we have to provide incentives to do that, if we have to provide waivers to the building code, waivers to the tax code, change the tax thing, then we need to do it. We need to do it. You need to start out, what are you trying to do? You're trying to get more housing. Where's it a great opportunity? Existing housing that's sitting empty. So what are the tools we need to bring in place to put that into play, whether it's listed historic or not? That'll be the number one priority in the whole housing strategy.
Great. So a message to Peg and Donovan, a question from Roy Smith, who says, that he's been living in a converted 1916 school building for the past 21 years. This was made possible by federal preservation tax credits, which are an important driver to make these kinds of conversions possible. So maybe a few words on that.
Yeah, one of my great disappointments with New York City, frankly, in the preservation world is the great underuse of the federal rehab tax credit in New York. And I get it. I get it. Well, it's the land values are so high, and to meet the test in the tax credit that you have to spend more than the basis in the building, it doesn't work. We can't do it. Well, then let's figure out a way to change it. You certainly have influential people in Congress. Let's make an exception. Or let's say if the land value is more than X, you don't have to whatever. But it is a crime that more tax act rehabilitation projects don't take place in the city of New York, and that makes a huge difference in the whole equation. But if the way the credit is structured is that you can't meet the test on the acquisition side, it's kind of a greatly underused tool. So Roy's a great friend of mine and a great world traveler. But that's right. It's a fabulous tool, and when you can combine it with the New York State historic tax credit, to combine it with low-income housing tax credit, it can be a really effective tool that cuts a lot of the cost of that, but it needs to be workable, and it doesn't seem to be in New York City.
We have an historic properties fund, and we do a lot of lower interest loans, and a lot of them are in census tracts that are available, are eligible for the state preservation tax credit. And so when one of our borrowers is eligible for that, we do all the paperwork for them. And so we've probably up to 15 or 16 so far, where we've really helped them get significant tax credits for the work they've been doing.
Great.
Yeah. Okay. A question in another direction. Are there any tools we can use to prevent facadism, demolishing everything behind the facade, and the combination of multiple buildings, or I guess units in historic districts? Oh, excuse me. The combination of multiple buildings that used to contain multiple units into one luxury home, and we see that a lot.
Yeah, Halloween preservation. You keep the mask and throw away the body. All of we make a whole range of arguments about the values of preservation, economic arguments, social arguments, environmental arguments. 100% of those arguments do not apply when you just have a facade, when the only thing you're keeping is 4 inches of brick. It's not historic preservation. It isn't. It isn't. It's not historic. You can call it what you want. It's not historic preservation. Furthermore, if I were the czar, I'd say, look, if we're going to let them tear down everything but the 4 inches of brick in the front, for God's sake, let's just have them build a well-designed, appropriate infill construction instead of that. It's more expensive. It's idiotic, and it is not historic preservation. Now, I don't know the kind of regulatory framework about the combining units. And again, it kind of works in a couple directions. Sometimes, again, not necessarily in the combining of buildings, but I remember when we did the first study for the Landmarks Conservancy, we were talking about this issue about density, and the higher density. We'd found other places in historic districts, and we were warned by, maybe it was by Peg or Andrea, or one of you said, well, yeah, but when you look at Park Slope, you're going to find something different. You're going to see actually a reduction in density because people are converting back what had originally been single family houses, over the years converted into 4 units and 4 floors, and being converted back into 1 or 2 units. And in fact, that happened. And I guess I see that a little less egregious than taking a place that was built for 40 units and converted into 4. I don't know the legal process you'd have to go to make that change, but I see it as a real serious issue. The other thing I think is sometimes missed. Of course, when there's so much wealth in New York, I don't know that anything makes any difference. But 60% or 65% of all the households in America are one-person households. Now, in Manhattan, particularly Manhattan and Brooklyn, that changes, where 4 of us have to live in one place to afford the rent. But the fact is that units are built thinking of the kind of Leave It to Beaver 1950 household with the wife and two kids staying home and the father going off to work. Well, nobody does that anymore. But that's often what's being built, where we ought to think we really ought to be building for who the households are, and that's not a family of four.
Okay, we've got some questions that I'm not sure that Peg and Donovan can answer them, but we've got a question. Someone says that one of the buildings that Peg showed was for people in the arts in Manhattan, and how do you apply to these places? I think we can send you that information, unless Peg, do you have any more on that?
I don't know, which, if you're talking about the place that was for the arts, it's now being converted into senior housing.
Okay, well, we will try to look into that. There's a question, will we be sharing the slides that Peg showed of the converted landmark buildings? And yes, we can send those out.
Well, we're going to send out this whole program. So we're going to send it out to all our members. We'll have it on our website and we'll have it on our YouTube channel. So we have plenty of opportunities to relive all of this.
Okay, question just came in. How do you square the endless push for replacing rent-controlled and rent-stabilized housing, which wasn't kept up immaculately, with ultra-luxury condominiums? And they used an example, which I'll throw out, and Donovan, you're not expected to know this, 16 Fifth Avenue, which went from 20 to 12 units. So kind of hitting on some of the themes we've discussed, but more specifically about the rent-regulated units.
And the question is, how do you stop that? I'm sorry, what was the question?
How do you square the endless push for replacing them with the need, with the, you know, the push for new ultra luxury condos?
I'm not sure you can. I live in a small historic district on the Upper West Side, and there used to be a lot of affordable units in the brownstone blocks. And even there, we're getting, going back to single family housing. And there's nothing LPC approves. There's nothing against it. I guess you really, and I'm not sure how you'd really have to look at the city as a whole and how often it's happening and have a real discussion on whether the city officials found this, a reasonable thing to continue or not.
Okay, we've got a specific technical question about energy conservation codes and landmark buildings. Donovan, do you want to hear more about this, or should we just connect this person with our colleagues who work on these issues?
Well, I don't have the conservation code stuff, so I can't answer that question, but I do have one of my favorite New York findings. And that is when Bloomberg was mayor, he said, I want to put New York City on the path to be the most energy efficient city on the planet. Good businessman that he is, he said, step one, we need an audit of who's using energy. Tens of thousands of residential units, commercial buildings did it. And this one didn't have anything to do with historic preservation. It only had to do with where we use the energy. But it was very comprehensive. It broke down with the buildings and stuff. So we've looked at that. I've cited it lots of times. Now, God bless you, environmentalists, but for decades, environmentalists kept saying, you got to get rid of those old buildings. They're the energy hogs. They're eating. You got to replace them with some green gizmo stuff and blah, blah, blah. Well, what that data showed, when you sorted the date by age of construction, the older the building, the less energy use there was. Every time you went another decade of age of the building, newer building, it was using more energy per square foot. In fact, it was the older buildings that were being conserving energy, not the green gizmo new stuff. I think we need to be thinking about that. And the reason is not accidental. It's when whoever built these buildings, there in my screen behind me, building there wasn't just a switch you could flip and be warm or cold, and so you had operable windows, you had high windows so you could get air circulation, you had positioning on the site to pick up, you had to make advantage of the environment with which you were in to make living in it comfortable. And then World War II comes along and engineers took over the world and said, oh no, we can just invent stuff to do all of that. Well, that was idiotic. That's what's blown away energy. We need to step back and see why are those older buildings less energy consumptive, and start making a whole different set of decisions about that.
Great, thank you. So we've gotten all the questions that were in the chat.
Okay. So if there are no more, I think that one of them, though, brought up a real issue of we have to continue programs like this, and we have to clearly make our voice heard at City Hall and in the state legislature, and do our best. We're not anti-development. We are for responsible development. And all the historic districts, the Landmarks Preservation Commission routinely approves additions to buildings and new buildings. They're not frozen zones. So new housing has been created in many of these areas. So we have a story to tell, and we have values to keep. So let's see, let's get to it. Thank you so much for joining us. Great thanks to Donovan Rypkema and his invaluable work and his great statistics. 2.3% for all the historic districts. Thank you, thank you. And thank you all for joining us. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.